In the bitter winter of 1881, in the isolated convent of Sacred Heart near the village of Thornwick, County Donegal, Sister Evangeline Blackwood orchestrated the most systematic act of mass murder ever documented in the annals of Irish religious history. Dr. Isadora Whitmore, the region's pioneering female physician and one of only 3 women practicing medicine in rural Ireland at the time, spent 18 months documenting the methodical poisoning of 27 nuns during what should have been their most sacred evening prayers. The sisters died in excruciating agony over the course of 3 horrific nights, while a dozen others survived with permanent neurological damage from what church authorities desperately tried to dismiss as contaminated well water. The official ecclesiastical investigation was buried under direct orders from Rome, its findings sealed in the Vatican's secret archives, where they remain hidden to this day. But the truth about Sister Evangeline's descent into madness and methodical evil reveals a darkness that shatters our understanding of religious devotion, feminine virtue, and the terrifying capacity for calculated cruelty that can lurk behind the most pious exterior. Before we journey into the nightmare that transformed a peaceful Irish convent into a chamber of systematic death, if this investigation into history's most disturbing religious mysteries compels you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and activate that notification bell so you never miss our explorations into the darkest corners of human nature. Drop a comment letting us know what country you're watching from. We're building a global community of truth seekers who aren't afraid to confront the most unsettling chapters of our past. The events that would elevate Sister Evangeline Blackwood from anonymous religious devotee to one of history's most calculating killers began not with sudden madness, but with the slow, methodical corruption of a brilliant mind trapped within the suffocating confines of 19th century religious life. The Ireland of 1881 existed in a state of perpetual tension, a nation still reeling from the catastrophic effects of the Great Famine that had claimed over 1 million lives just 3 decades earlier, while simultaneously chafing under the increasingly oppressive weight of British colonial administration. The Catholic Church represented far more than spiritual guidance in this landscape of suffering and subjugation. It served as the backbone of Irish identity, the keeper of Gaelic traditions, and often the only institution that provided education, healthcare, and social services to a population systematically denied basic rights by their colonial overlords. Convents like Sacred Heart were not merely places of worship, but essential pillars of community survival. They operated schools for peasant children, infirmaries for the sick, and sanctuaries for women who had nowhere else to turn. The convent of Sacred Heart sat perched on a wind-swept hill overlooking the village of Thornwick, a settlement so remote that many maps of County Donegal failed to include it entirely. The convent had been established in 1834 by the Sisters of Mercy, founded with donations from Irish-American emigrants who had prospered in Boston and New York, but never forgotten the poverty of their homeland. The building itself was constructed from local gray stone, its austere Gothic architecture designed to inspire contemplation rather than comfort. 28 nuns called Sacred Heart their home in the winter of 1881, ranging in age from novice Sister Mary Catherine, barely 19 years old, to the venerable Mother Superior Agatha, who had governed the convent for over 2 decades. These women had surrendered worldly possessions, marriage prospects, and family connections to dedicate their lives to prayer, service, and the education of local children who would otherwise grow up illiterate. Sister Evangeline Blackwood had arrived at Sacred Heart in the spring of 1876, carrying credentials that immediately distinguished her from the typical rural Irish women who comprised most of the convent's population. Born in Dublin to a Protestant family of modest means, she had converted to Catholicism at 18, a decision that resulted in complete estrangement from her Anglican relatives and forfeiture of any inheritance or family support. What made Sister Evangeline truly exceptional was her education. Before her religious conversion, she had attended the prestigious Alexandra College in Dublin, where she had excelled in natural philosophy, chemistry, and botany, subjects considered highly unusual for women of any background in Victorian Ireland. Her academic achievements were so remarkable that several of her professors had privately suggested she might pursue advanced medical training in Edinburgh or London, possibilities that vanished the moment she embraced Catholic faith. Dr. Isadora Whitmore first encountered Sister Evangeline in the autumn of 1877 when she was summoned to Sacred Heart to treat an outbreak of influenza that had affected several of the younger nuns. Dr. Whitmore herself was an anomaly in rural Irish society, a woman who had fought for the right to practice medicine in a world that viewed female physicians with suspicion, if not outright hostility. She had completed her medical training at the London School of Medicine for Women, one of only 12 institutions in the British Isles that would accept female students, and had returned to Ireland with a determination to serve the rural poor who had no access to qualified health care.
During that first visit to Sacred Heart, Dr. Whitmore was struck by Sister Evangeline's sophisticated understanding of anatomy and physiology. While other nuns deferred to religious explanations for illness, viewing sickness as divine punishment or spiritual trial, Sister Evangeline asked pointed questions about disease transmission, treatment protocols, and the chemical composition of various medications. Her inquiries demonstrated a grasp of scientific principles that rivaled many of Dr. Whitmore's male colleagues. Sister Evangeline possesses one of the most analytical minds I have encountered in my medical practice, Dr. Whitmore wrote in her private journal following that initial visit. Her questions about pathology and pharmacology suggest formal training that extends far beyond anything typically provided in convent education. There is something almost unsettling about the intensity of her scientific curiosity, particularly when discussing topics related to poison and its effects on human physiology. The convent's daily routine was structured around the canonical hours, periods of prayer that divided each day into segments of worship, work, and minimal rest. The nuns rose at 4:30 each morning for lauds, followed by private meditation, then breakfast in complete silence. Their days were filled with teaching local children, tending the convent gardens, maintaining the building and grounds, copying manuscripts, and providing basic medical care to villagers who could not afford Dr. Whitmore's services. Sister Evangeline had been assigned to oversee the convent's extensive herb gardens and pharmacy, a role that suited her botanical knowledge and gave her access to a remarkable variety of medicinal and potentially toxic plants. The gardens contained everything from common healing herbs like chamomile and lavender to more exotic specimens that Sister Evangeline had somehow acquired through correspondence with other religious institutions across Europe. Mother Superior Agatha, a shrewd woman in her 60s who had governed Sacred Heart through the worst years of the famine, initially viewed Sister Evangeline's scientific interests as beneficial to the convent's mission of healing. The younger nun's ability to compound effective medicines and her understanding of plant chemistry had saved several lives among the local population. Children suffering from respiratory infections, elderly villagers struggling with arthritis, and women enduring difficult pregnancies had all benefited from remedies prepared in Sister Evangeline's pharmacy. But Mother Superior Agatha also possessed the intuitive wisdom that comes from decades of reading human character, and she had begun to notice subtle changes in Sister Evangeline's behavior during the summer and autumn of 1881. The younger nun had become increasingly withdrawn from community activities, spending long hours alone in the pharmacy and gardens. She had also begun keeping detailed journals, not the spiritual reflections encouraged among the sisters, but technical notebooks filled with observations about plant chemistry and the effects of various compounds on living organisms. When questioned about these writings, Sister Evangeline explained that she was documenting traditional Irish folk remedies to preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost as older generations passed away. The explanation was plausible and even admirable, but Mother Superior Agatha noticed that Sister Evangeline had begun conducting what appeared to be experiments on the convent's livestock and the small animals that lived around the grounds. Sister Mary Catherine, the youngest novice, confided to Mother Superior Agatha that she had observed Sister Evangeline feeding different plants to chickens and rabbits, then carefully recording their reactions in her notebooks. When some of the animals became sick or died, Sister Evangeline showed no distress. Instead, she performed what looked like crude dissections, examining internal organs with the detached interest of a natural philosopher, rather than the compassion expected from a woman dedicated to preserving life. There's something frightening about the way Sister Evangeline looks at us during prayers, Sister Mary Catherine whispered to Mother Superior Agatha during one of their private consultations. It's as if she's studying us the same way she studies her plants and animals, like we're specimens in some sort of experiment, rather than her sisters in Christ. The village of Thornwick itself existed in a state of precarious survival that was typical of rural Ireland in the 1880s. Perhaps 300 souls lived in stone cottages scattered across the boggy moorland, subsisting on potatoes, cabbage, and whatever fish they could catch from the turbulent North Atlantic. The men worked as tenant farmers on estates owned by absentee English landlords, while the women raised large families and struggled to stretch meager resources through the harsh Donegal winters. The closest market town was Glenveigh, a full day's journey by cart along roads that became impassable during winter storms. This isolation meant that the convent operated with minimal oversight from church authorities in Dublin or Rome, a situation that gave Sister Evangeline considerable freedom to pursue her increasingly disturbing interests without outside scrutiny.
Dr. Whitmore maintained a circuit that included Thornwick and a dozen other remote settlements, but the treacherous roads meant that she could only visit each location once or twice per month. During her regular stops at Sacred Heart, she had begun to notice troubling changes in the convent's atmosphere. The nuns seemed more anxious and subdued than during her earlier visits, and several had approached her privately with complaints of mysterious illnesses that seemed to come and go without explanation. Sister Margaret, who supervised the convent's kitchen, reported persistent stomach problems and episodes of dizziness that occurred primarily during evening prayers. Sister Rose, who taught the youngest children, described periods of confusion and memory loss that left her unable to recall entire conversations or lessons. Sister Agnes, who maintained the convent's financial records, had developed a tremor in her hands that made writing increasingly difficult. When Dr. Whitmore examined these women individually, she found symptoms that suggested possible poisoning, but the effects were so subtle and intermittent that she could not identify a specific cause. The symptoms seemed to affect different nuns at different times, with no clear pattern that would indicate contaminated food or water. More puzzling still, Sister Evangeline appeared to be completely unaffected by whatever was causing her sister's mysterious ailments. Dr. Whitmore began keeping detailed medical records of her visits to Sacred Heart, documenting symptoms, timing, and potential environmental factors that might explain the nuns' declining health. What emerged was a pattern that should have served as a clear warning. The mysterious illnesses coincided with periods when Sister Evangeline had been responsible for preparing herbal teas and tonics that were consumed during evening prayer sessions. The convent's evening prayer routine had evolved into something unique under Mother Superior Agatha's leadership. Rather than simply reciting traditional liturgy, the nuns would gather in the chapel at sunset to share communion wine and herbal tea while reflecting on the day's spiritual lessons. This custom had been inspired by descriptions of early Christian communities and was viewed as a way of strengthening the bonds between the sisters while honoring ancient traditions of communal worship. Sister Evangeline had gradually assumed responsibility for preparing these evening refreshments, claiming that her knowledge of medicinal herbs allowed her to create blends that would promote spiritual contemplation and physical well-being. The other nuns had welcomed this contribution, particularly during the harsh winter months when warm, aromatic tea provided comfort against the cold and dampness that pervaded the old stone building. What none of them realized was that Sister Evangeline had begun using these evening gatherings as opportunities to conduct systematic experiments in human poisoning. Her notebooks, discovered months later during the investigation, revealed a methodical approach to testing various toxic compounds in carefully measured doses. She had been gradually increasing concentrations and trying different combinations of plants, documenting the effects on her unsuspecting sisters with the clinical detachment of a research scientist. The entries in Sister Evangeline's journals read like the work of a medical researcher rather than a woman dedicated to religious service. Subject 7 exhibited increased respiratory distress and disorientation approximately 30 minutes after consumption. Pupils remained dilated for over 2 hours. Muscle coordination noticeably impaired during evening prayers. No apparent lasting effects by morning. Recommend increasing dosage for next trial. Mother Superior Agatha had begun to suspect that something was seriously wrong with the convent's evening prayer sessions by early December 1881. Too many of her nuns were experiencing mysterious symptoms that seemed to coincide with their communal gatherings. She had also noticed that Sister Evangeline displayed an unusual level of interest in her sisters' physical and mental states, asking detailed questions about their symptoms and taking careful notes about their responses to various treatments. When Mother Superior Agatha attempted to discuss her concerns with Sister Evangeline directly, she encountered a level of intellectual arrogance and barely concealed contempt that shocked her. The younger nun made it clear that she viewed herself as intellectually superior to her sisters and chafed at being subject to the authority of women she considered ignorant and superstitious. These simple peasant women have no appreciation for the advancement of scientific knowledge. They cling to primitive superstitions while remaining willfully blind to the opportunities for research that our isolated situation provides. I am surrounded by perfect subjects for experimentation, yet constrained by their ignorance and the pointless religious restrictions that govern this place. The transformation of Sister Evangeline from dedicated religious servant to calculating killer had been gradual but inexorable. Her superior education and scientific training had created a sense of intellectual isolation that gradually curdled into resentment and contempt for her fellow nuns. The restrictions of convent life, the enforced poverty, the limitations on personal freedom, the requirement to submit to religious authority, had become increasingly intolerable to a woman who viewed herself as destined for greater achievements.
By the winter of 1881, Sister Evangeline had reached a psychological breaking point where she no longer saw her fellow nuns as human beings deserving of compassion and protection, but as obstacles to her intellectual fulfillment and convenient subjects for her increasingly ambitious experiments in toxicology. The stage was set for a systematic massacre that would transform Sacred Heart from a place of peace and prayer into a laboratory of death. The first phase of Sister Evangeline's plan had involved months of careful preparation and testing. She had identified the most effective toxic compounds available from the plants in her gardens and had determined optimal dosages through her experiments on animals and the gradual poisoning of selected nuns. She had also established patterns of behavior that would provide her with alibis and explanations for the deaths she was planning to orchestrate. As December 1881 drew to a close, Sister Evangeline was ready to move beyond individual experiments to what she privately referred to as the comprehensive trial, a systematic poisoning that would eliminate the entire convent population and provide her with the ultimate test of her scientific theories about human mortality and suffering. The horror that was about to unfold at Sacred Heart would challenge everything the local community believed about religious devotion, feminine virtue, and the capacity for evil that could lurk behind the most pious exterior. Dr. Isadora Whitmore would soon find herself documenting the most systematic act of mass murder in Irish religious history, while struggling to understand how a woman dedicated to healing had transformed into an instrument of calculated death. The Ireland that Sister Evangeline Blackwood inhabited in 1881 was a nation caught between ancient traditions and the brutal realities of colonial subjugation, where the Catholic Church served as both sanctuary and prison for women who sought meaning beyond the narrow confines of Victorian domesticity. To understand how a brilliant woman dedicated to religious service could transform into a calculating killer, one must first comprehend the suffocating social, economic, and intellectual constraints that shaped every aspect of Irish life during this turbulent period. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 had carved wounds into Irish society that still festered 3 decades later. Over 1 million people had died from starvation and disease, while another 2 million had fled to America, Australia, and other distant shores in desperate search of survival. The population of Ireland had plummeted from over 8 million to barely 4 million, leaving vast stretches of countryside dotted with abandoned stone cottages and overgrown fields that served as monuments to unimaginable suffering. County Donegal, where the convent of Sacred Heart stood sentinel over the village of Thornwick, had been among the hardest-hit regions during those terrible years. The remote northwestern corner of Ireland had always been poor, but the famine had reduced it to a landscape of almost biblical desolation. Entire townlands had been depopulated, their inhabitants either dead or scattered to the winds of emigration. The survivors who remained were those too poor to afford passage abroad, too old to travel, or too stubborn to abandon the land their ancestors had worked for countless generations. The British colonial administration that governed Ireland showed little interest in addressing the underlying causes of this ongoing suffering. The island was viewed primarily as a source of agricultural products for English markets and a strategic buffer against potential continental enemies. Irish tenant farmers were expected to produce grain, beef, and dairy products for export while subsisting on potatoes and hope. When the potato blight struck, the colonial government's response had been characterized by bureaucratic incompetence, ideological rigidity, and callous indifference to Irish suffering. By 1881, a new generation of Irish political leaders had emerged, demanding fundamental changes in the relationship between Ireland and Britain. The Irish Parliamentary Party, led by the charismatic Charles Stewart Parnell, was pressing for home rule that would grant Ireland limited self-government.
The Irish Land League, founded by Michael Davitt, was organizing tenant farmers to resist evictions and demand fair rents, free sale, and fixity of tenure. These movements represented the first sustained challenge to British dominance since the failed rebellion of 1798. But political organizing and parliamentary maneuvering offered little comfort to the women trapped within Ireland's rigid social hierarchy. Irish society in the 1880s provided few opportunities for female independence or intellectual fulfillment. Most women faced a stark choice between marriage, often arranged for economic rather than romantic reasons, or religious life. Those who chose neither path were condemned to exist as burdens on their families or servants in other people's households. The Catholic Church had filled the vacuum left by the destruction of traditional Gaelic institutions, becoming not merely a religious organization, but the primary provider of education, healthcare, and social services throughout rural Ireland. Convents like Sacred Heart served multiple functions that extended far beyond their spiritual mission. They operated schools that provided basic literacy to children who would otherwise grow up unable to read or write. They maintained infirmaries that offered the only medical care available to the rural poor. They preserved ancient traditions of manuscript illumination, herbal medicine, and textile production that might otherwise have been lost forever.
For intellectually gifted women like Sister Evangeline, religious life represented both opportunity and imprisonment. Convents offered access to libraries, laboratories, and scholarly pursuits that were denied to women in secular society. The Sisters of Mercy, who had established Sacred Heart, were among the most progressive religious orders in Ireland, encouraging education and scientific inquiry among their members. Several convents operated what amounted to informal universities, where nuns pursued advanced studies in theology, natural philosophy, and classical languages. Yet these same institutions imposed restrictions that could prove psychologically devastating for women accustomed to intellectual freedom. The vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience were designed to eliminate personal ambition and individual achievement in favor of communal service and spiritual development. Nuns were expected to suppress their own desires and submit completely to religious authority. For women who had tasted the intoxicating freedom of academic achievement, this surrender could feel like a kind of spiritual death. Sister Evangeline's background made her particularly ill-suited for the psychological demands of convent life. Born Evangeline Blackwood in Dublin in 1847, she had grown up in a Protestant household that valued intellectual achievement and encouraged her unusual aptitude for scientific subjects. Her father, Robert Blackwood, worked as a clerk in the colonial administration, earning enough to provide his family with middle-class respectability and educational opportunities that were denied to most Irish Catholics. Young Evangeline had displayed remarkable intellectual gifts from an early age. She devoured books on natural philosophy, conducted crude chemical experiments in the family's garden shed, and demonstrated an understanding of botanical principles that impressed even her formally educated teachers. Her parents had initially been delighted by their daughter's scholarly achievements, viewing them as evidence of Protestant superiority over Catholic ignorance and superstition. Alexandra College, where Evangeline completed her advanced education, was one of the few institutions in Ireland that provided rigorous academic training for women. Founded in 1866 as part of the broader movement for female education, the college offered instruction in mathematics, natural sciences, classical languages, and modern literature. The curriculum was designed to demonstrate that women possessed intellectual capabilities equal to their male counterparts, though graduates were still barred from most professional careers. Evangeline's conversion to Catholicism at age 18 had been motivated by a complex mixture of intellectual conviction, romantic idealism, and psychological rebellion against her family's expectations. She had been profoundly moved by the philosophical sophistication of Catholic theology,
particularly the medieval synthesis of Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine developed by Thomas Aquinas. The Catholic emphasis on mystery, symbolism, and transcendence appealed to her in ways that Protestant rationalism never had. But her conversion had come at an enormous personal cost. Her family had disowned her completely, viewing her decision as both religious betrayal and social suicide. Her father had burned her personal belongings and forbidden anyone in the household from mentioning her name. Her mother had taken to her bed with what she claimed was a nervous breakdown brought on by her daughter's apostasy. Former friends and teachers at Alexander College had shunned her as a traitor to Protestant civilization. The isolation that followed her conversion had been psychologically devastating for a young woman accustomed to intellectual stimulation and social recognition. The Catholic community in Dublin had welcomed her as a trophy convert, but few Catholics possessed the educational background necessary to engage with her scholarly interests. She found herself suspended between two worlds, rejected by Protestant society, yet unable to find true intellectual companionship among her new co-religionists. Religious life had initially seemed to offer a solution to this dilemma. The Sisters of Mercy promised her opportunities to use her scientific knowledge in service of the poor, while providing the structured community life that might heal her psychological wounds. Mother Superior Agatha, who had interviewed Evangeline before accepting her as a postulant, had been impressed by the young woman's academic credentials and apparent spiritual sincerity. The early years of Sister Evangeline's religious life had indeed provided some measure of satisfaction. She had thrown herself into her duties with characteristic intensity, establishing the convent's pharmacy, expanding the herb gardens, and developing new treatments for the ailments that afflicted the local population. Her scientific knowledge had saved lives and earned her the grateful respect of both her fellow nuns and the broader community. But the psychological wounds inflicted by her family's rejection had never properly healed. Beneath her outward dedication to religious service lay deep wells of resentment, loneliness, and frustrated ambition. The intellectual isolation of convent life gradually eroded her capacity for empathy and human connection. She began to view her fellow nuns not as sisters in Christ, but as intellectual inferiors whose limited understanding constrained her own potential for achievement.
The daily routine of convent life, which had initially provided comforting structure, had become a source of mounting frustration by 1880. The canonical hours that divided each day into periods of prayer felt like arbitrary interruptions to her scientific work. The requirement to seek permission for even minor decisions chafed against her natural independence. The enforced poverty that prevented her from acquiring better equipment and reference materials seemed like a deliberate obstacle to intellectual progress. Dr. Isadora Whitmore, during her regular visits to Sacred Heart, had begun to recognize signs of Sister Evangeline's psychological deterioration. As one of the few women in Ireland who had successfully pursued advanced education and professional achievement, Dr. Whitmore understood the particular pressures that affected intellectually gifted women in a society that provided few outlets for female ambition. Dr. Whitmore's own journey to medical practice had been fraught with obstacles that would have defeated most women of her generation. Born in County Cork in 1845, she had demonstrated early aptitude for mathematics and natural sciences that her family had initially encouraged as harmless eccentricity. But when she expressed serious interest in pursuing medical training, she encountered fierce opposition from relatives who viewed female physicians as unnatural aberrations that threatened the foundations of Christian civilization. The London School of Medicine for Women, where Dr. Whitmore had completed her training, was a revolutionary institution that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and intellectual capacity. Founded in 1874 by pioneering feminists like Sophia Jex-Blake and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, the school provided rigorous medical education to women who were barred from traditional universities.
The curriculum was deliberately demanding, designed to demonstrate that female physicians could meet the same academic standards as their male counterparts. But graduation from medical school had been only the beginning of Dr. Whitmore's struggles. Establishing a practice in rural Ireland had required overcoming suspicion, hostility, and professional sabotage from male colleagues who viewed her presence as an unwelcome intrusion into their domain. Many patients initially refused treatment from a female physician, believing that women lacked the physical strength and emotional stability necessary for medical practice. Dr. Whitmore had gradually built her reputation through competence, persistence, and willingness to serve patients that male physicians considered beneath their attention. She had become the primary healthcare provider for much of County Donegal's female population, treating conditions that women were too embarrassed to discuss with male doctors. Her success had been built on hard work, clinical skill, and an intimate understanding of the particular health challenges that affected Irish rural women. This background gave Dr. Whitmore unique insight into Sister Evangeline's psychological condition. She recognized in the younger woman the same intellectual frustration and social isolation that she had experienced during her own struggle for professional recognition. But where Dr. Whitmore had channeled her ambitions into legitimate medical practice, Sister Evangeline's energy was being twisted by the constraints of religious life into something far more dangerous. The convent's physical environment contributed to the psychological pressures that were affecting Sister Evangeline's mental state. Sacred Heart had been constructed during the 1830s according to architectural principles that emphasized spiritual contemplation over physical comfort. The building was a masterpiece of austere Gothic design, with soaring stone walls, narrow windows, and corridors that seemed designed to inspire religious awe rather than human warmth. Winter months were particularly harsh within the convent's stone walls. The building's heating system consisted of a few strategically placed fireplaces that provided minimal warmth against the bitter Donegal winds that swept across the surrounding moorland. Ice formed regularly on the interior walls of individual cells, and the nuns often woke to find their water basins frozen solid. The communal areas were slightly warmer, but still required heavy woolen robes and constant movement to maintain basic comfort. The psychological effects of this physical environment were compounded by the social isolation that characterized life in rural Donegal. Sacred Heart was located nearly 15 miles from the nearest town of any significant size, connected to the outside world by a single muddy road that became impassable during winter storms. Mail arrived irregularly, newspapers were weeks out of date when they finally reached the convent, and visitors were rare enough to be considered significant events. For a woman of Sister Evangeline's intellectual background, this isolation was profoundly damaging. She had been accustomed to the stimulating environment of Dublin's academic community, where new ideas circulated freely and scholarly debate was encouraged. The convent's library, while extensive by rural Irish standards, consisted primarily of religious texts and devotional literature. Scientific journals, philosophical works, and contemporary literature were either unavailable or heavily censored by church authorities.
The other nuns at Sacred Heart, while sincere in their religious devotion, lacked the educational background necessary to engage with Sister Evangeline's scholarly interests. Most had come from peasant families, where basic literacy was considered sufficient education for women. They viewed Sister Evangeline's scientific pursuits with a mixture of admiration and suspicion, unable to understand her work, but vaguely concerned that it might conflict with religious teaching. Mother Superior Agatha, despite her practical wisdom and administrative skill, was fundamentally conservative in her approach to intellectual matters. She had been trained during an earlier era when the Catholic Church was deeply suspicious of scientific inquiry, viewing it as a potential threat to religious faith. While she appreciated the practical benefits of Sister Evangeline's pharmaceutical knowledge, she remained uncomfortable with what she perceived as excessive interest in worldly matters. This intellectual isolation had begun to manifest in Sister Evangeline's behavior during community prayers and meals. She had become increasingly critical of what she viewed as her fellow nuns' intellectual limitations, making comments that bordered on contemptuous about their inability to understand basic scientific principles. During theological discussions, she would cite obscure philosophical texts that none of the other sisters had read, using her superior education as a weapon to establish intellectual dominance. The transformation of Sister Evangeline's scientific interests from healing to harm had been gradual but inexorable. Her initial experiments with medicinal plants had been motivated by genuine desire to help her fellow nuns in the local community. She had developed effective treatments for common ailments, created improved versions of traditional remedies, and established protocols for pharmaceutical preparation that ensured consistent quality and potency. But as her psychological isolation deepened, Sister Evangeline's scientific work had taken on a darker character. She began conducting experiments that served no therapeutic purpose, testing the effects of various toxic compounds on small animals with methodical precision. Her notebooks from this period reveal a growing obsession with the mechanisms of death, the progression of poisoning symptoms, and the possibilities for causing suffering that would appear accidental or natural. The winter of 1880 to 1881 had been particularly severe, with storms that isolated Sacred Heart for weeks at a time, and temperatures that made basic survival a daily challenge. The psychological pressure of confinement within the stone walls of the convent, combined with the physical discomfort of inadequate heating and limited food supplies, had pushed several of the nuns to the breaking point of their endurance. Sister Evangeline had used this crisis as an opportunity to begin her systematic experiments in human poisoning. The harsh conditions provided perfect cover for unexplained illnesses, while the isolation prevented outside medical attention that might have identified the true cause of her victims' suffering. Her fellow nuns, weakened by cold and malnutrition, were particularly vulnerable to the toxic compounds that she began introducing into their food and drink. The evening prayer sessions that Sister Evangeline had gradually taken over represented the culmination of her strategic planning. By positioning herself as the provider of warming herbal teas during these communal gatherings, she had gained the perfect mechanism for administering controlled doses of poison to multiple victims simultaneously. The religious context provided psychological cover, making it unlikely that her fellow nuns would suspect deliberate harm from someone dedicated to spiritual service. As 1881 drew to a close, Sister Evangeline had completed her preparations for what she privately termed the comprehensive experiment. Her months of careful testing had identified the most effective toxic compounds, established optimal doses, and created delivery mechanisms that would ensure maximum suffering while minimizing the likelihood of detection. The stage was set for a massacre that would transform Sacred Heart from a sanctuary of peace into a laboratory of methodical death. The horror that Sister Evangeline unleashed upon Sacred Heart began on the evening of December 21, 1881, during what should have been the convent's most sacred winter solstice prayers. 27 nuns gathered in the candlelit chapel, unaware that their trusted sister had prepared herbal tea infused with a carefully calculated mixture of digitalis, aconitine, and ricin, extracted from castor beans she had cultivated in secret garden plots behind the convent's walls. Dr. Isadora Whitmore received the desperate summons at dawn on December 22, 1881, when young Timothy O'Brien, the convent's groundskeeper, arrived at her clinic in Glenveagh with news that half the nuns at Sacred Heart were dying in agony. What she discovered upon arrival defied her medical training and challenged everything she believed about human nature.
The chapel floor was strewn with the writhing bodies of women she had known and treated for years, their faces contorted in expressions of unimaginable suffering. Sister Evangeline moved among her dying sisters with clinical detachment, ostensibly providing comfort, but actually documenting symptoms with the methodical precision of a researcher recording experimental data. Dr. Isadora Whitmore noticed immediately that Sister Evangeline showed no signs of illness herself, despite claiming to have consumed the same tea that was killing her fellow nuns.
The cardiovascular distress patterns are exactly as predicted, Sister Evangeline whispered to Dr. Whitmore, believing she had found a kindred scientific spirit. The digitalis affects the heart rhythm first, then the aconitine attacks the nervous system, while the ricin ensures cellular breakdown that makes recovery impossible. I've spent months calculating the perfect combination. Dr. Whitmore realized with mounting horror that she was witnessing not a tragic accident, but a meticulously planned mass murder conducted by a woman who viewed her victims as laboratory specimens rather than human beings. The confession that followed revealed the full scope of Sister Evangeline's methodical evil. 18 months of gradual poisoning experiments, detailed records of suffering and death, and a complete absence of remorse for the destruction she had caused. The investigation that followed exposed the depth of Sister Evangeline's psychological transformation from healer to killer. Her hidden journals contained over 300 pages of experimental notes, anatomical drawings of poisoning effects, and philosophical reflections on the nature of death that revealed a mind completely disconnected from human empathy. She had viewed her fellow nuns not as sisters in faith, but as convenient subjects for research that she believed would advance scientific understanding. Sister Evangeline's capture was almost anticlimactic. She offered no resistance when Dr. Whitmore and the arriving authorities confronted her with the evidence, instead expressing disappointment that her comprehensive experiment had been interrupted before she could complete her documentation of the full death process. Her primary concern was ensuring that her research notes would be preserved for future scientific study. The legal proceedings that followed created unprecedented challenges for the Irish justice system. The idea that a woman religious could systematically murder her fellow nuns violated fundamental assumptions about feminine virtue and spiritual devotion. Sister Evangeline's superior education and articulate defense of her actions as scientific research further complicated efforts to understand and prosecute her crimes. Dr. Whitmore spent months documenting the case, creating what would become one of the first systematic studies of female mass murder in criminal history. Her detailed medical and psychological evaluations revealed Sister Evangeline as a woman whose intellectual gifts had been corrupted by isolation, resentment, and a complete absence of moral constraint. The case would influence discussions about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the dangers of unchecked intellectual pride for decades to come. Sister Evangeline was ultimately confined to the Dundrum Criminal Lunatic Asylum in Dublin, where she spent her remaining years conducting botanical experiments under careful supervision. She never expressed remorse for her actions, maintaining until her death in 1923 that her crimes had been justified by their contribution to scientific knowledge. Her research notes were sealed by church authorities and remain hidden in Vatican archives to this day. The convent of Sacred Heart was abandoned immediately after the massacre, deemed too tainted by evil to continue serving as a house of worship. The building stood empty for decades, gradually falling into ruin as local residents avoided the site they believed to be cursed.
The surviving nuns who recovered from Sister Evangeline's poisoning attempts were transferred to other convents, but many suffered permanent neurological damage that affected them for the remainder of their lives. Dr. Whitmore continued her medical practice in rural Ireland for another 30 years, but the Sister Evangeline case haunted her professional life. She became one of Ireland's leading authorities on toxicology and criminal psychology, publishing influential papers on the recognition and treatment of poisoning cases. Her detailed documentation of Sister Evangeline's crimes provided crucial evidence for understanding how seemingly normal individuals could transform into calculating killers. The broader implications of the Sacred Heart Massacre continue to resonate through Irish society and criminological study. The case demonstrated that evil could flourish even within institutions dedicated to spiritual service, and that intellectual sophistication provided no protection against moral corruption. Sister Evangeline's ability to maintain her facade of religious devotion while conducting systematic murder challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of wickedness and the reliability of outward piety. The 27 women who died at Sacred Heart were victims not just of poison, but of a mind that had lost all connection to human compassion and moral restraint. What lessons can we draw from this dark chapter in Irish history? How do we recognize when intellectual gifts become divorced from moral responsibility? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And subscribe to our channel for more investigations into history's most disturbing mysteries. Remember, the most dangerous monsters are often those who hide behind masks of respectability and virtue.